However, from the perspective of the sun, the Earth is moving. According to the theory of relativity, there is no way to establish which is the case, because the movement of the two bodies is only movement relative to the other body. This maxim of relativity effectively kills the null result of the Michelson-Morley experiment, since, according to the theory of relativity, the null result was only a matter of relative perspective. Under the theory of relativity, if you were to fall on your face, it cannot be said that you fell to the ground. It is equally likely that the Earth rose up to meet your face. That is the kind of silly conclusion brought about by the theory of relativity. In addition to the above relativity of motion, Einstein theorized that time slows down the faster one travels. For example, if a twin, Paul, takes a trip on a spaceship at near the speed of light and he returns to Earth 10 years later, his twin brother, Peter, left back on Earth, will have aged 10 years, but the twin on the spaceship would only have aged very little. The problem with that postulation from Einstein is that under the theory of relativity, the movement of each brother is relative. Each twin sees the other as moving, and therefore each brother should have aged more slowly than the other brother. The conclusion under the theory of relativity is that Peter has aged more slowly than Paul, and at the same time, Paul has aged more slowly than Peter. Of course, it is impossible for each twin to age more slowly than the other twin. The twin paradox is chosen by this author because it very simply illustrates the issue. Professor Dingle, however, never actually used the twin paradox because there is an alleged quirk in that example that gives the supporters of the theory of relativity an out, or so they allege. They assert that there is no symmetry since the twin on the spaceship is traveling outbound and inbound, which involves two inertial frames. Of course, that is pure sophistry, and addressing such nonsense is beyond the scope of this book. Professor Dingle was too well versed in the theory of relativity to allow the promoters of relativity such an easy out, so he steered clear of using the aging twins example. He instead used an example of two clocks moving in the same trajectory at different speeds. Professor Dingle asked scientists all over the world to assist him in finding an answer to the paradox using speeding clocks, with one clock traveling faster than the other in the same direction. Every scientific journal in the world refused to even address the paradox that Dingle raised. No one could resolve the paradox, and the scientific community seemed to think it was impolite to even discuss it. Quote, I can present the matter most briefly by saying that a proof that Einstein's special theory of relativity is false has been advanced and ignored, evaded, suppressed, and indeed treated in every possible way except that of answering it by the whole scientific world. Close quote. In science, a paradox is a self-contradictory conclusion that is logically impossible. A theory that causes a logically impossible result is necessarily wrong. A paradox in the theory of relativity simply had to be suppressed by the high priests of science. Professor Dingle laid out the paradox, which has never been resolved to this day as follows. Quote, according to the theory, if you have two exactly similar clocks, A and B, and one is moving with respect to the other, they must work at different rates, i.e., one works more slowly than the other. But the theory also requires that you cannot distinguish which clock is the, quote, moving one. It is equally true to say that A rests while B moves, and that B rests while A moves. The question therefore arises, how does one determine, consistently with the theory, which clock works more slowly? Unless this question is answerable, the theory unavoidably requires that A works more slowly than B, and B more slowly than A, which it requires no superintelligence to see is impossible. Now, clearly, a theory that requires an impossibility cannot be true, and scientific integrity requires, therefore, either that the question just posed shall be answered, or else that the theory shall be acknowledged to be false. But, as I have said, more than 13 years of continuous effort have failed to produce either response. Professor Dingle concludes that, quote, the magical influence of this word, relativity, has transformed science in this field into a superstition as powerful as any to be found in primitive tribes. Close quote. We have it on the authority of Professor Dingle, one of the foremost experts on the theory of relativity, that the theory of relativity is false. Neville Martin Gwen describes the irrationality that is woven through the warp and woof of the theory of relativity. Quote, the concept of relativity attached to Einstein's name and propagated by him represents an attack on human reason so insidious and diabolical and so successful that no opportunity of demonstrating its falsity, and not only its falsity, but to anyone prepared to believe his own powers of reason, its blatantly obvious falsity, should be allowed to pass. Gwen proves that most of the elements of the theory of relativity were not the discoveries of Einstein. Gwen properly describes them as inventions. Indeed, if one examines the historical record, the only reasonable conclusion is that Einstein plagiarized the entire theory of relativity. Gwen states that, quote, Einstein's works can be searched from beginning to end without revealing a single original thought of real importance. Gwen documents the little-known historical facts that Einstein stole his ideas from other scientists and passed them off as his own. He plagiarized their work. He gave no attribution to the other scientists. Quote, curved space, for instance, was thought of by Riemann, adding a fourth dimension, that of time, to geometry to create the new concept of space-time, by Minkowski. The doctrine that objects contract in proportion to the speed at which they moved, by Fitzgerald, and the idea that the velocity of light in a vacuum was constant irrespective of the motion of any object connected with the light ray, by Lorentz. Did he, Einstein, first assert the impossibility of detecting the velocity of light through the ether? No, this was done by J.H. Poincaré and H.A. Lorentz. Did Einstein coin the name relativity? No, Poincaré did. It was Poincaré, too, who first asserted that no velocity can exceed that of light. Einstein was not the first to assert that a clock in motion runs slow. This was done by Sir Joseph Larmor. Einstein was not the first to assert that matter is crinkles in curved space. Professor W. K. Clifford advanced this quaint notion in 1870, 9 years before Einstein's birth. Did Einstein even invent the famous equation E equals mc squared, which has become almost synonymous with his name, the equation from which nuclear energy and nuclear destruction capability are supposedly derived? Not even that. In 1881, J. Thomson had produced a formula E equals 3/4 mc squared in respect of a charged spherical conductor moving in a straight line. In 1900, Poincaré suggested that electromagnetic energy might possess mass density in relation to energy density, such that E equals mc squared, where E is energy and m is mass. Plagiarization is intellectual theft. The unimpeachable record proves that Einstein was not a genius, but was simply a very clever con man with powerful backers. Gwen concludes that, quote, "The truth about Einstein is that he was no more than a puppet," close quote. Gwen presents compelling evidence that Einstein was selected to play the specific role of refuting the Michelson-Morley experiment and reestablishing the rotation globular Earth. If Einstein had not existed, another would have been selected to fill his place, for he possessed no qualities which are not available in profusion in almost any place in any age. The obstinate truth about Einstein is that in mathematics he was no more than competent, and that among the so-called discoveries presented to the world under his name, one can search in vain for one that was original. Had Einstein not been selected, for reasons which had nothing to do with his intellectual ability, to act out a role which was deemed necessary for the furtherance of the war against God and civilization, his claim to immortal fame would have been that of a talented and not undistinguished physicist, a lifelong Zionist, and occasionally enthusiastic admirer of Stalin's Russia. Einstein was a front man for very powerful interests behind the theory of relativity. That theory was simply an amalgamation of theories propounded by many scientists over many years. As Gwen points out, the global elite needed to have a single frontman for their theory to be popularly accepted. Quote, "It is much easier to impose false beliefs on the world if they are personalized. If a theory is put forward without reference to the person who originated it, there will be a tendency for it to be judged on its merits, and then, if it clearly has no merits, for it to be rejected. This is far from being the case if a theory, however ludicrously opposed to common sense, is put forward by a man of universally acknowledged genius. When that happens, the tendency will be for the theory to be examined with respect. If it cannot be understood, this will be ascribed to the incapacity of the person examining the theory. If it appears manifestly illogical, it will be assumed that the originator has grasped a logic which is beyond the reach of lesser mortals. In short, it will gradually become accepted on no better grounds than the authority of the person who has advanced it." Close quote. Why was Einstein, of all people, chosen to be the front man? There are very powerful intergenerational interests behind promoting Einstein. These interests have an occult religious agenda to enslave the world. Martin Gwynne identifies the core of the conspiracy as Jewish. That Einstein was a Zionist Jew was probably the qualifying factor that put him at the top of the list to be the mouthpiece for the satanic conspiracy to send the scientific world into darkness through the theory of relativity. From the middle of the 19th century onward, those presented to the world as modern geniuses marking the turning points in civilization have been Jews. I do not wish to exaggerate this, and it is certainly true that non-Jews too, such as Darwin at the beginning of the period and Lord Keynes in more recent times, have had their nonsense presented as majestic contributions to human knowledge. Nevertheless, if asked to name the three men whose writings had the greatest influence in shaping the modern world, few would go beyond Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Albert Einstein. Explanations for the phenomenon, adequate or otherwise, are suggested elsewhere in other papers that I have written. Here I record only the fact and the inference that can be derived from it. The Jews are entering into what they believe to be their inheritance. If it be accepted that it was desirable to build up the reputation of a single man for the difficult task of imposing relativity on the world, and that that man should be a Jew, why was Einstein, out of all the other Jewish scientists available, chosen to play the role assigned to him? One can only speculate. Clearly, his being a Zionist and a communist would have recommended him highly to those who selected him. It seems to be agreed by all who come in contact with him that he had much charm, probably indispensable in the task allotted to him. And eyewitness accounts of his lectures provide evidence of considerable abilities as an actor and a showman, which, for the successful accomplishment of the purpose for which he was used, are talents even more necessary than charm. There must, however, have been many other people with similar or better credentials, even in a population restricted to people interested in physics. Failing some revelation by those who chose him, all that can be said is that we need to have little doubt that he earned his duties and his privilege somehow. I have given some indication of what Isaac Newton did to earn the rewards that he received, and is still receiving in this world. Those who recall this and take seriously verses 8 and 9 of the 4th chapter of St. Matthew have little alternative to the belief that such fame and adulation as Einstein received in his lifetime and has received since, and which on the face of it are wholly undeserved, must have been earned at the expense of an extremely exacting bargain in respect of his immortal soul. Again, the devil taketh him up into an exceeding high mountain, and showeth him all the kingdoms of the world, and the glory of them, and saith unto him, All these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. After the general acceptance of Einstein's theory of relativity, science entered into a strange new world, where experiments were not done using instruments in the physical world, but instead using mathematics in the mind of the scientists. Einstein was famous for announcing new, quote, mind experiments, close quote. Einstein claimed that he did not know of the Michelson-Morley experiment prior to coming up with his special theory of relativity in 1905. Robert Shanklin published an article in 1963 in which he stated that Einstein told him in 1950 that he only became aware of the Michelson-Morley experiment after he had published his paper on special relativity in 1905. Shanklin pointed out that, indeed, Einstein did not mention the Michelson-Morley experiment in his 1905 paper, suggesting by that fact that Einstein did not know about the Michelson-Morley experiment. Einstein's claimed ignorance of the Michelson-Morley experiment is contradicted by other statements that he made, indicating that, in fact, he did know about the experiment. Einstein is on record admitting that he did, in fact, know about the Michelson-Morley experiment, and it played a role in his theory of relativity. Einstein's biographer, Ronald Clark, stated that one of the principal issues for science with the Michelson-Morley experiment was that the experimental results proved that the Earth is stationary. Clark explained the implications of the Michelson-Morley experiment meant that the whole Copernican theory had to be scuttled, which was, quote, unthinkable for the scientific community. Einstein never mentioned the Michelson-Morley experiment in his 1905 paper announcing his theory of special relativity. In 1942, Einstein claimed to Michelson's biographer that he had already become, quote, pretty much convinced of the validity of the relativity principle before I did know this Michelson-Morley experiment and its results, close quote. It seems that Einstein was trying to avoid having anyone connect his theory of relativity with the Michelson-Morley experiment. However, the historical evidence suggests that Einstein was lying. Think about it. How could anyone believe that Einstein would be ignorant of the Michelson-Morley experiment when in fact it was the talk of the entire scientific community? His claimed ignorance simply does not pass the smell test. Regardless, we have proof that Einstein lied when he claimed ignorance of the Michelson-Morley experiment. 42 letters were uncovered between Einstein and his fiancée, Mileva Mera. Those letters reveal that, in fact, Einstein knew about the Michelson-Morley experiment as early as 1899. In addition, in a recently uncovered 1922 speech that Einstein delivered at Kyoto University in Japan, Einstein admitted that he was aware of the Michelson-Morley experiment and the, quote, strange result, close quote, of that experiment affected directly his theory of special relativity. Quote, while I had these ideas in my mind as a student, I came to know the strange result of the Michelson experiment. Then I came to realize intuitively that if we admit this as a fact, it must be our mistake to think of the movement of the Earth against the ether. That was the first route that led me to what we now call the principle of special relativity. Close quote. That speech was translated from Japanese notes and the translation has been criticized by 2 Japanese academicians. It seems that it is important to many in the scientific field to cast some doubt on whether Einstein knew about the Michelson-Morley experiment. However, there is confirmation that the translation from the Japanese notes is accurate. That confirmation comes in the form of a speech Einstein gave a year before his Kyoto speech, during which Einstein similarly admitted that he knew about the Michelson-Morley experiment before he came up with his theory of special relativity. In May of 1921, during a visit to the University of Chicago, where Michelson was on the faculty, Einstein gave a short speech at the Francis W. Parker School. In that speech, he stated, in pertinent part, "I thought about whether it would be possible to perceive through some experiment that the Earth moves in the ether. But when I was a student, I saw that experiments of this kind had already been made, in particular by your compatriot Michelson. He proved that one does not notice anything on the Earth that it moves, but that everything takes place on Earth as if the Earth is in a state of rest." Close quote. The above 1921 statement by Einstein impeaches his later claims that he did not know about the Michelson-Morley experiment. Joran van Doggen draws the ineluctable conclusion from Einstein's 1921 statement that Einstein knew about the Michelson-Morley experiment long before he came up with his special theory of relativity, and that the Michelson-Morley experiments influenced his theory of special relativity. Quote, "What does the Parker School lecture imply for our understanding of Einstein's relation to the Michelson-Morley experiment and its influence in the creation of the special theory? Taking the text at face value, there can be no doubt that Einstein knew of the Michelson-Morley experiment prior to 1905. He attributed a significant role to the ether drift experiments in general, and singled out the Michelson-Morley experiment for special mention. It further suggests that Einstein had learned of the experiment before becoming convinced of the principle of relativity, contrary to his later recollections." Why was Einstein so insistent in later years in claiming he was ignorant of the Michelson-Morley experiment? Because he could not allow there to be any connection made between his theory of relativity and the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment. To do so would give up the game. His theory of relativity was trotted out, publicized, and crammed down the throats of academia for the sole purpose of explaining away the Michelson-Morley result that proved the Earth does not move. Einstein could not allow the world to know that. Hence, he falsely claimed that he did not even know about the Michelson-Morley experiment when he devised his theory of relativity. Most people do not know that Einstein was a con artist chosen to play a role. In order for his theory of relativity to maintain its status, however, the powerful elite must also maintain Einstein's esteem as a paragon of intellect. If Einstein is found out to have been a fraud, then his theory of relativity will be scrutinized and found out to be an elaborate scientific deception. Consequently, Einstein has been elevated to the stature of a scientific demigod. and the world's propaganda machine intends to keep him there. For example, Frederick Golden in Time magazine described Einstein as follows, quote, "He was the embodiment of pure intellect. He was unfathomably profound. The genius among geniuses who discovered, merely by thinking about it, that the universe was not as it seemed. His ideas, like Darwin's, reverberated beyond science, influencing modern culture." Close quote. What was the occasion for such praise from Time? Golden was describing Einstein in the December 31st, 1999 Time magazine cover story about him. Einstein had been named Time magazine's Person of the Century. Think about that for a moment. Albert Einstein was selected as the most influential person from among all the persons who lived during that 20th century. That should give some idea of the importance to which the powerful elite running the world think it is to keep people ignorant of the fact that the earth does not move. That brings to mind the warning of Jesus. "Woe unto you when all men shall speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets." Luke 6:26. Apparently, some very powerful interests are very happy about the hoax of Einstein's theory of relativity. These powerful interests are dark and evil. Jewish-controlled Time magazine is owned by one of the largest media conglomerates in the world, Time Warner. The founders of Time magazine were Britton Hayden and Hendrie, who were both members of the satanic secret society, the Brotherhood of Death, commonly known as the Skull and Bones Society. President George W. Bush, in his autobiography, A Charge to Keep, stated, quote, "During my senior year, I joined Skull and Bones, a secret society, so secret I can't say anything more." Close quote. What is so secret that he cannot speak any further about it? The secret is that in return for power, wealth, and fame, he must blindly obey his satanic masters in their Antichrist conspiracy to enslave and rule the world. The initiation ceremony for Skull and Bones involves, but is not limited to, the inductees lying naked in a coffin and telling their deepest sexual secrets. Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, in his Satanic Rituals, companion to the Satanic Bible, states that such a coffin ritual is a satanic ritual common in many pagan orders. During the ritual, a powerful spiritual force charges through the participants, transforming their lives dramatically. This powerful spiritual force is a devil. The participants in these ceremonies end up possessed by a devil. Evidence indicates that the Order of Skull and Bones, founded at Yale in 1832, is a chapter of the Illuminati, which was originally founded in 1776 at the University of Ingolstadt in Germany. From this, we know that the Skull and Bones is not American at all, but is a branch of a foreign secret society. As with the Jesuits and the Illuminati, Skull and Bones has many ostensible Gentiles who are members. From this fact, most people have mischaracterized the Skull and Bones as a purely Gentile organization. That is not true. Just as with the Illuminati and the Jesuits. The Skull and Bones is controlled by and serves the interest of Zionist Jews. George W. Bush is a prime example of an ostensible Gentile member of Skull and Bones who acted in the interest of Israel to the detriment of the United States. He was completely controlled by Zionist Jews. The Jewish control of Skull and Bones comes from its roots as a chapter in the crypto-Jewish Illuminati. Some of the practices and terms of the Skull and Bones reveal the Jewish nature of the order. For example, those outside Skull and Bones are referred to by Skull and Bones members as vandals and, quote, Gentiles. Furthermore, in an attempt to conceal the meanings of their writings from any Gentile outsider who may obtain a copy, members of the Skull and Bones often obscure key words by deleting the vowels. For example, patriarchs would be written as P-TR-RCHS. Bones would be written as B-N-S. The Hebrew alphabet does not have vowels. They use accent marks, and so Jews are accustomed to writing without using vowels. It is not surprising that they would follow that same practice when trying to conceal the meaning in their writings from the uninitiated Gentile world. The Skull and Bones use the Hegelian dialectic to change society into a totalitarian state. Under Hegel's dialectic, there must be a conflict, either real or perceived, between a thesis and an antithesis, which is resolved by the synthesis of the two. The secret societies create these conflicts in order to move society regressively away from Christ and Christian principles and toward Satan and satanic principles. David Bay explains the origin and power behind the Kabbalistic Skull and Bones. Quote, "The Brotherhood of Death Society in the United States is the Skull and Bones Society in Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. Its belief structure is identical to that of the Thule Society. Therefore, we can conclude that Bonesmen affirm this belief about Jesus Christ, thus condemning them to committing the unpardonable sin. The list of some of the families comprising Skull and Bones is frightening, for it immediately shows the extent to which America has been influenced by the satanic organization. Remember, the men of these families have likely committed the unpardonable sin." This was quoting from Anthony Sutton, America's Secret Establishment, page 22. Rockefeller family, Standard Oil. Weyerhaeuser family, lumber. Sloan family, retailing. Pillsbury family, flour milling. J.P. Morgan family, banking. Taft family, politics. Bush family, including former President George Bush. Wait a minute, you say. George Bush likely committed the unpardonable sin because of his membership in Skull and Bones? Yes. Now you can see how easy it was for Bush to lead the charge into the satanic New World Order. Now you can see that Bush was far different in his innermost heart than he was on his media-created surface. David Bay mentions Skull and Bones member George H.W. Bush spearheading the satanic New World Order. Indeed, President Bush stated in his State of the Union address before a joint session of the U.S. Congress regarding the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq that, quote, "What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order." President Bush was not leading anything. He was simply an effeminate sycophant who was obedient to his Zionist overlords. A little-known fact is that one of the first public mentions of a, quote, New World Order was in reference to the worldwide interests of the Jews. The October 6, 1940 issue of the New York Times reported that Arthur Greenwald, member without portfolio in the British War Cabinet, assured the Jews of the United States that when victory was achieved, an effort would be made to found a new world order. The message from Greenwood was delivered by Rabbi Maurice L. Perlswig, chairman of the British section of the Executive Committee of the World Jewish Congress, to Dr. Stephen S. Wise, chairman of the Executive Committee of the World Jewish Congress. Greenwood's message was to the Jews and for the Jews. Greenwood's statement was designed to enlist the powerful Jewish interests in the war with Germany. By making that promise, England had promised the Jews English assistance in gaining Jewish hegemony over a new world order. If the Jews would use their enormous resources and influence to deliver the United States into the war against Germany. Indeed, that is exactly what happened. The, quote, New World Order is a world domination by the Jews. It is the goal of the Zionist conspiracy. The Skull and Bones Society is just one of the many occult organizations doing the work of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Ephesians 6:12. That spiritual truth seems to have been missed by Dr. Dingle. He simply could not understand how and why the clearly fallacious theory of relativity could gain such universal acceptance in the scientific community. Dr. Dingle, in frustration, asked, quote, "How is it possible that such an obvious absurdity as the theory of relativity should not only have ever been believed, but should have been maintained and made the basis of almost the whole of modern physics for more than half a century, and that, even when pointed out, its recognition should have been universally and strenuously resisted in defiance of all reason and all the traditions and principles of science." On November 17, 1952, the Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, asked Albert Einstein to accept an invitation to become the President of Israel upon the authorization of the Knesset of Israel. Einstein turned down the offer, but the offer is testimony to the importance and esteem with which Einstein was held among the Jews. It also demonstrates the political importance of the theory of relativity to the Jews. The descent in the minds of men of God who created a flat, immovable earth gives rise to the ascent of Jews in power and influence in the world. Having the earth become one of many millions of planets in the universe, and a rather insignificant one at that, drives from the minds of men any thought that God created a unique earth at the center of his creation, and that man is made in his image. Once God is removed from the thoughts of men, it is then possible to introduce ideas of, quote, everything is relative, close quote, where there is nothing inherently good or bad, because it is all relative to a person's own ethical opinion. There is no longer reference to absolutes contained in the Bible. Morals become malleable, with each man a lawmaker in his own right. So we see that the theory of relativity is a theory that bleeds into all aspects of society. Indeed, read in Psalm 19, verse 1 through 8, how there is a direct correlation between knowledge of God's creation and his commandments. Concealing the glory of God as declared by his handiwork makes it very easy to introduce concepts of relative morality. All manner of sin can then be justified, such as abortion and sodomy. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line is gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them hath he set a tabernacle for the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. His going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it, and there is nothing hid from the heat thereof. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. Psalm 19,